E-commerce students, welcome to Chapter 4. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about what it actually takes to create an e-commerce presence. As we are moving quickly through the first quarter of the 21st century, we're starting to see that a website isn't enough. We've got social media, we've got apps, and different types of primary ways for people to reach our companies. And so it's not the same as it used to be. It's also important to put as some perspective for this chapter that what we'll be talking are classic styles of building websites and e-commerce presences. In reality, there's a lot of alternatives now. People are looking more at things like Shopify. They're looking at other ways to create e-commerce in a box. And we're going to be talking about how this all plays together. So what are our objectives? The objectives are to know really the business requirements and information requirements that go into creating a web presence. And whether you're creating your own website or whether you're creating a really well-run Shopify store, the same principles apply. We're also going to be talking about scaling with hardware. This is one of those things I doubt you'll use frequently unless you get into the really back end of an e-commerce company. Somebody's actually concerned with maintaining hardware, but it's important to know it because it's some of the fundamentals, it's some of our history, and if you get into the industrial level of things, yes, you will actually have to know how this stuff works. And we're going to talk about what some of the other considerations are in building these kinds of presences. So when we start thinking about our e-commerce presence, what we got to start off with is why do we exist? What's our mission? Who do we want to reach? Again, going back to the previous chapters, what is our market space? Are we talking about a highly competitive market space or someplace we've got an opening? We're going to talk strategy too in terms of what our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. How are we going to reach out to the people who would want our product? Again, we need to know our audience. We need to know our demographics. In terms of how we would build a timeline for rolling out an e-commerce project and what our original budget might be. Again, these are very fundamental concepts. You will have to uniquely apply them to your business idea, but this is our starting point. We also need to think about our business revenue models from our previous chapters. How are we making money here? Are we a transaction broker? Are we actually doing a traditional e-commerce sales model where we are charging an upcharge or making a profit on selling things with a markup? Who are the people we want to reach? How are they most likely to reach our product or service? Again, if we're going for the under 25 crowd, you better be thinking mobile. And again, how big of a potential audience do we even have in the first place? How are they structured? Is this a growth market or not? So again, we need to also know where our content is coming from. In other words, are we producing our own unique descriptions on a website because we're producing unique products and services, or are we drop shipping? The idea of knowing ourselves. We're going to talk about why a SWOT analysis is important today. We're also going to talk about how you build a map for your e-commerce presence. How do people actually navigate your site? And how do you build a project for this kind of a situation? I would hope also if these are kinds of things that are interesting to you, you might also want to get into the discipline of project management, because when it comes to building websites, it has to be a linear process. Things have to be done in a certain order. And the idea of how much this is going to cost, I think a lot of people have this idea that you can just go on to Wix, throw up a website, and you'll have e-commerce. In reality, a well-functioning basic website, you're going to get into the game for right around $5,000, and the bigger you are, the more scaling you have to do. These kinds of big numbers are exactly why companies like eBay and Shopify and even Amazon are really popular to small e-commerce retailers, because they don't have to build the mechanisms. They can get right in and start selling. And we're going to talk about that as well. So when we start off anything, it's good to look at a SWOT analysis. It's the classic root of all business analysis, which means we're looking at what are our strengths? Do we have something that we're doing that other people are not? Do we have a customer base that's growing, that's increasing? Are we in a new and emerging part of the market where there's value, where people see value? What are our weaknesses? Well, do we have enough startup capital? Do we have experience in selling or building websites? Do we have ways to get attention for our products? Opportunities. Are there people who want something that doesn't exist in the market yet? Are there other competitors who aren't doing a good job? Threats. Are you going to be the first to market with this idea? Could somebody scoop your idea? Are there people who would take and run with the ideas you come up with and make them better? Do you have the capabilities to be able to get in and actually develop what you're talking about? And also, other companies, is it something easy for people to become competitors? So that's our SWOT analysis. When you look at your presence map, you've got to look at really 4 particular categories. What we're going to be focusing on is website and social media, but all of these are part of our e-commerce presence. For example, if you're building a website or a mobile app or both, you've got to look at several potential platforms. In other words, how are people actually accessing it? Are they using a laptop computer? Or are they using a traditional desktop? Are they using mobile, which means smartphones? Are they using tablets? And in terms of the activity that we want to be able to have this be a successful form of commerce, we need to be able to have it show up in search if somebody uses Google or Bing to find our particular product or service. We also need to be able within our own website to have search. We need to be able to display our products or services. If we're using affiliates, if we're going through other companies and selling through other companies and other brands as well, we need to have those or sponsorships on as well. Again, it depends on the nature of your company. If you're using social media, the biggest question is what platform or platforms? Generally speaking, different platforms appeal to different lifestyles and age groups, but it's not universal. For example, Facebook Marketplace is fairly popular across demographics for local e-commerce. But you would have to know, for example, and our textbook's a little behind the times here, and the fact we'd also be adding things like Snapchat on here as well, adding TikTok. So what is our activity there? It's not the same as traditional selling. If somebody goes to your traditional website or your mobile app, they're coming to buy something. If somebody comes for your social media presence, they're coming to get involved with your company. How do you engage them? Then we talk about email. Email is one of the oldest but most powerful forms of e-commerce. And the reason being is it costs next to nothing. We may have legacy lists that go back decades with people, and we know their behavior. If you signed up for email and you're using a customer loyalty program, we have a way of knowing what you like. It's very powerful. And the activity there is to let people know what they can buy from us, what's going on. Tends to be a more powerful marketing tool with, dare I say, people my age, Gen Xers and above, as opposed to people maybe who are millennials or Gen Z who don't have as much affinity to email. Offline media is still important. Why? Because when you get an ad on during the Super Bowl, it shows that you've made it. Google still buys billboards. Why? Because they want to make sure that they are reminding people that they exist. And it's part of our overall marketing mix. So this is part of our presence map, even if it's not all online. So when we start thinking about how we want to build our presence, the bottom line is you need to think business first. Anything you're doing online, anything that you are creating in terms of websites should come from what your business objectives are. And the toughest part is knowing your own business. That is the most difficult part, knowing what goes into making a business successful. Having an e-commerce presence and having an electronic or automated system will not fix a bad system. So the things you need to think about: who's going to run this presence? Who's going to make sure your orders get fulfilled? What about your hardware? If you're actually building a website from the ground up, are you going to buy hosting from somebody, or are you going to host it yourself? I would say at this point in time, because we're talking 2023 and beyond, very few small e-commerce businesses are going to host their own sites. What kind of software are you going to use? Are you going to use an e-commerce in a box platform? Or are you going to actually build your own website from scratch? And that gets into the design. The more you build from scratch, the more you build internally, the more control you have. And then we get into telecommunications. That simply means, what's your internet connection going to look like? If you're hosting with somebody such as GoDaddy or Amazon Web Services, they take care of that portion for you. We are going to cover the telecommunications simply because we covered the history of the internet in the last chapter, and you're going to get to see how that fits together. And finally, the most difficult part of any system is the part between the monitor and the keyboard, and those are the humans. They are the toughest part of any system. So ultimately, this comes down to knowing and understanding how the systems analysis or systems development lifecycle works. It means that you've got several steps into building any system. The first is you're going to see what your needs are. Systems analysis and planning says this is what we want to do. We want to sell Batman action figures through social networks and Batman interest groups. Our systems design. Well, Facebook Marketplace is a good place for us to go. We don't need to build our own site. Or conversely, we want to build our own presence from the ground up. Building the system. What does your system need to do? It needs to be able to show products. It needs to be able to track orders, allow customers to track their orders. Testing. How many people can hit this website at the same time without it coming crashing down? And once you've done all these things, you implement, and it goes circular because you're constantly reevaluating. This is classic systems analysis and design. So again, if we look at this in context, again, you're looking at what requirements your system needs to have to be able to function in the real world. Once you do your systems analysis, then you build the system based on what your needs are. So you start off with addressing what do we want the site to do, what functionality does it need to have, we can build it, we test it, and we implement it. And ultimately, you notice, it comes back to the beginning because you're going to be revising this site all the time. It can be very challenging because, for example, when users see change, they're not always happy about change. They're not always happy when the website they're used to using looks different all of a sudden, and it happens because we change and revise. Even companies like Amazon sometimes get blowback from their users. Social networks in particular, when they change, people are not always happy about it. And so we need to think about that as well. So when we get into this is the first and most important part. What are your business objectives? If you don't have a concept about making money or being profitable, you don't have an e-commerce business, you just have a website. So what capabilities will support our business objectives? And those translate into system functionality. So the business objectives are what you want to sell, how you want to do business, what products you want to move and supply people with or services. System functionality is how we make that happen. And information is what we need to put into the system to be able to accomplish the business objective. So the business objective is ultimately making money. System functionality is facilitating that. And information is what we need to put into the system so people know what to buy and where to buy it. So here's some examples. The most fundamental thing you could do from a traditional e-commerce business is supply or display what you're selling. So the system functionality would be the digital catalog function. And we need to have information there. We need to have pictures. We need to have descriptions. Product information. Again, we might want a product database so people can search our products. But we also need people to write the descriptions. There are entire careers, by the way, for people whose entire job just is writing descriptions of stuff to be on websites, for example. That is a business career that people have. Again, we get into engaging customers in conversations. This is one, by the way, where there's going to be a lot of opportunity for AI. So there's got to be some sort of system functionality, whether it's a user or a user forum or a chat blog or even a chat bot or something like that. And finally, the information requirements are what's going to populate those. If you've got information coming from an AI, it's going to be more dynamic, and so on and so forth. Again, just to hit a couple more of these. If you want to make sure people are supported after they buy things, you might want to have a database so you can reach out to people and regularly follow up with them. And to do that, you're going to need a way to reach out to them. So again, the business objective is what you want to accomplish. The system functionality is how your web presence accomplishes this particular action, and the information requirements of what information needs to be in the system to accomplish the business objective. So we start looking at hardware and software platforms. The system design simply means how things fit together and how they work. And there's two ways that we do it. There's logical and physical. Logical simply means how does data move through a system. Physical is what actual components do we need to have so that the logic can actually happen. So for example, a logical design of a car is that I can hit a gas pedal and the engine fires up and I'm able to go forward. A physical design would mean I need a physical pedal, I need a transmission to connect the engine to the axle and so forth. So physical design is how the components actually fit together. Logic is how the information moves. So here's an example of the difference between a logical and a physical design. So a logical design simply shows that if somebody gets onto a website, they log in, they're searching products, and there's multiple backs and forths going on here within the same system. So that's the logic. The physical part is, if we look on the bottom, the customer's going through the internet and hitting the website, which has a number of components in it. For example, you might have a database, you might have an online catalog, mail server, etc. So again, logical is how information moves through a system, how things need to happen in what order. Physical is what components actually need to be in that system. So again, just to close up on this in terms of a simple design, our customer, for example, here is connecting through the internet to the firm's website. You can see the detail a little better here. So should you build in-house or outside? The bottom line is that most people who are building small e-commerce websites are outsourcing at least part of it now. Since the time we started really discussing business-to-consumer e-commerce as a discipline, things have changed. Even in the last 10 years, they have changed in the fact that very few people are hosting their own websites. Now, when we talk about building versus outsourcing, you can design your own website, do the work yourself, and still host it somewhere else. For example, you can use GoDaddy. That means you're still doing the work, you're still doing the design, you're still actually deciding what the website looks like, but you're hosting it with them. Or you can pay somebody to come and do the design for you. The biggest change is there. If you pay somebody to do the design for you, obviously that associates cost. You're going to have somebody who you're going to pay by the hour or by the job to do the design work, and you have less control. But if you don't have expertise, that might be a better way to go. Hosting is much the same. You can pay somebody else to host your website, which most people do at this point in time, or you can do what we actually refer to as co-location, which means that you can have a server, a physical piece of hardware that you actually own, but that you host it at somebody else's facility. Why would you do that? Let's say, for example, I could build a computer, and we can still do that, and I could run it in my apartment, for example, or my house, but I only have one internet connection, I have limited power, where if you host with somebody like Amazon or GoDaddy, they have big server facilities with lots of capability. The bottom line is, unless you are an enterprise e-commerce provider who wants that level of control, think Amazon.com, think Nike, outsourcing might be completely acceptable. And in fact, many large e-commerce companies and even the US government outsource and host with a lot of other companies as well. So you can go with any extreme. You can build in-house and host in-house all the way to completely outsourced. And again, the biggest advantages to insourcing are control and potentially cost. The biggest disadvantages are running out of expertise in terms of how to create a website, and also not having redundancy in terms of power and internet service. And so again, the more outsourced you go, the more stability you have in those regards, but the more control you give up and more potential costs you take on. I cannot see a situation in which somebody would find it advantageous to host their own website at home in 2023 and beyond. I cannot see a practical reason for it. Now, when we start testing the system, we can test units, which means we might test a component of the system. Oh, is our catalog displaying properly? Can we do a test transaction, make sure that somebody is getting paid? That gets us to system testing, which means we're going to look at everything as one concurrent system. Does it all function well together? Then we get to acceptance testing. For example, did our system accomplish goals A, B, and C? We can say that we accept them. A/B testing means we might try two different approaches. Well, what if we have a one-click purchase option versus a two-click purchase option where people have to go through one layer of a cart versus two layers of a cart? Which work better and why? And multivariate testing means we're going to try this under different loads. In other words, we can simulate if 500 people are hitting our website at the same time. How well does it do? You might need to bulk up your capability. Now, the other thing to note there, it all depends on the nature of your business. If I'm Amazon, I'm getting hit thousands of times a second. My website is very busy. If I've got my own personal website for selling, I don't know, custom-made bass guitars, and I get 10 hits a day, then a small, less obtrusive and less robust system might be just fine. So that's what we call multivariate testing. So in terms of implementation and maintenance, I like to say that the systems can be unpredictable, but you should know your points of failure. And what that means is you should be constantly checking on your system. How many people are hitting us? How much downtime did we had? Basically, it's a good budgetary figure. Whatever you spent to create your website, budget that for an annual budget of upkeep, and you will always have a contingency. When we say benchmarking, again, we're going to look last year in December when we were getting into the Christmas rush, how many users were hitting us and how did our systems respond. And that means we're going to benchmark to be able to function at that level this year as well. For example, if you outsource, if you host with somebody like Amazon or GoDaddy, you also will pay for different tiers of service depending on how much uptime you want for your site and how many users you think are going to hit it. So what are the factors in how well a website works? Well, the first is page generation, and that simply means, for example, the server itself. If we're dynamically creating pages, does the server have a lot of RAM? Does the server assemble pages quickly? Do we have a fast computer, for example? Those are all internal to the actual place where your website lives. Then we've got the page delivery. What do your networks look like, for example? Are people connected through high or low speed? What about your connection to the internet? By the way, generally speaking, because again, we know we are in a heavy-duty client-server environment right now, meaning that we've got all these thin clients called smartphones that don't have all that much computing capability of their own. If the networks aren't working well, that's going to drastically affect performance of our sites and apps, for example. And then finally, the actual page content itself. Do you have a lot of junk code on your page? For example, in the early days when people were writing their own websites, there tended to be a lot less bad code because people had to manually create it. When we got into point-click website creators, they sometimes inserted unnecessary code which would slow the page down. What about the images? Are the images themselves too large, too high resolution? We start talking about site architecture. We're going to talk about that in the following slides. How are you separating your computing capability? And finally, in terms of efficient page style, do you have a menu that actually stays the same across pages so it can be cached locally, for example? And what that means is, for example, every time you go to a website, if you've got Chrome, for example, at its default settings, certain pages will actually be in your local computer and load more quickly. And so that would be efficient page style, for example. So in terms of other ways we develop, when we say prototyping or agile, I would kind of put those together. These are the only ones I really want you to know much about. Prototyping or agile development simply means that we are in an environment now. The old method of systems analysis and design was known as the waterfall model. And that meant you got absolutely everything perfect before you rolled a system out. And our current environment is called agile, also known at times as a prototype environment. We tend to roll things out knowing some things might not work properly and that we're going to be continually revising. It gets more quick development done, but it's also why, for example, Windows is downloading patches every week. Some of the other ones that I really care that you know about, component-based development simply means we can insert functionality into a website or into an e-commerce presence simply by buying it these days. For example, if you want to add credit card processing, you can add that component in whenever you are setting up your website if you're hosting with somebody like GoDaddy. And in terms of web services, what we're talking about now too, in terms of a service-oriented architecture, we're talking essentially now that most people are buying components for their websites as services. And another great example of that is credit cards. If we are using credit card functionality, why would we set up our own credit card server when we can buy that as a service, for example? So what about how we actually build our websites? When we start talking about system architecture, that simply means how our system is put together and how we are going to scale it. It's going to be vertical or horizontal. The smallest system we can get to is what we refer to as a two-tier. And that means that for an e-commerce website, you've got a web server that makes sure that the website's actually running, and you've got a database server. And the database actually is making sure that we are transacting with our customers, that we're tracking user accounts, that we're giving people on their custom-generated page products they're actually interested in. When we get into a multi-tier, that means you're separating the functionality of the web server into separate servers. The biggest advantage of this system is that you're making your components more standalone, you can make them redundant, you also have an easier time keeping a website up when one component is failing. The illustrations will make this make sense. And a two-tier architecture, again, your web server and your database might even be on the same machine if it's a small enough website. Where if we get into, for example, a multi-layer architecture, it simply means we're taking components of the website and putting them on their own servers. Now, there's something that a lot of people in the MIS field, and in particular computer science, work in called virtual servers. And that means, for example, you can take one physical computer and give it an operating system that will allow it to run multiple servers on the same box at the same time. It's like giving a human being, multiple personalities that coexist. You can do that on a server as well. What I expect you to know, though, for a multi-tier environment, the web servers are always the first layer you would hit. That is the web server layer. The middle tier means where all our e-commerce stuff happens, where people buy, where they're able to see catalogs, where they're able to get in and make purchases. The back end is how we align all of these things with our other business functions. Logistics, hiring, for example. We can see that our customer service is slow. The HR function can be tied into that as well. When you get to a larger company like Amazon, this is what you're going to see. So what happens when companies fail to recognize how their servers are going to need to be able to handle traffic, how their networks are going to need to stand up, how they fail to construct a system adequately? Well, that's what we get with the Affordable Care Act. Whenever the ACA rolled out back in the mid-2010s, there was such a demand for the public health care exchanges that they crashed repeatedly. The government had failed to anticipate the size and the scope of the systems they were going to need, and ultimately had to hire people such as Amazon and Google to come in and help them reconstruct it. So servers crash when they get overwhelmed with simultaneous users, or the networks aren't adequate to handle all the traffic coming toward them. So even somebody with limitless resources, so it would seem, such as the federal government, can still screw up in this regard. Web servers themselves can, as we mentioned in a previous chapter, we can use this term to refer to software or hardware. The most popular one on the market is Apache, and it's based off an old operating system, Unix, and it's free. Anybody can download Apache and use it, and so it's very popular. Microsoft is a competitor to Apache, and theirs is called IIS. Why do people use IIS instead of Apache or another Unix or Linux-based system? Well, because if you get something for free, the support is also what you pay for, which is non-existent. So even if you buy, or even if you get an Apache system for free, either you support it yourself or you pay somebody else too. There are companies that will support your system, where IIS, because it's a Microsoft licensed product, is more point and click and comes with built-in support. So what do web servers do? Bottom line, and we'll talk more about some of this stuff in terms of security in later chapters, but essentially they keep a display of websites up. They make sure that when people are hitting our domain, that number one, the domain is registered and communicating with the computer that it's registered to, the domain it's registered to, that we're maintaining some kind of security such as SSL, which again we'll talk about in a later chapter, that we're able to allow people to search our website for an internal search engine, that we're capturing user data when it comes in, and even maybe email associated with our domain, and again allowing people to manage our sites. So what are some of the site management tools we might need? Things that we would need, for example, are things that would check links to make sure we don't have dead hyperlinks on our pages, for example. But we also want to make sure that we are doing things like tracking user data. Are people spending much time on our site? What's the average time that people are spending? The people who are buying products versus those who are not, what's the difference in their behavior? What can we note from them that maybe we want to change about the way we're running our website? For example, how many hits are we getting at key times of the day? Why is that important? Well, is our connection adequate? Are we operating fastly enough? In terms of dynamic page generation, this is not a computer science class, but you should be familiar with these terms and most importantly, familiar with the concept. One of the most useful tools in terms of customization is dynamically generated content. And all I mean by that is that if you log on to website X, let's say again it's Amazon, and I log on to website X, let's also say it's Amazon, our front pages will look different based on our interests, based on our behavior, based on our relationship with this company. Why is this great? Well, it's great because we get to have a personalized experience. It's great because you can even charge different people different prices if you want to incentivize them to buy something. It makes it a more automated experience as well, and the fact that somebody isn't creating custom pages. And again, this is every reason in the world to maintain some sort of customer relationship management system so that your experience is unique to the individual. And again, some of the tools that we use for this are things like active server pages. My biggest concern is that you're familiar with the concept. We talk about application servers. I mentioned earlier that we were talking about, for example, splitting a website into a multi-tier architecture. You might have specific servers that do nothing but serve up video, or that handle e-commerce transactions. Have you ever noticed when you go onto one of your favorite websites and they're having a partial outage? Maybe you can still hit the page, but you cannot go to certain pages. You cannot conduct a transaction. Well, the reason the page is up in the first place is because they went to a multi-tier architecture. If you do this, you're also able to make more system redundancy as well. So we can also have what we refer to as e-commerce in a box. And this is called merchant server software. And again, a lot of this is sort of going by the wayside, by the old traditional model of actually purchasing an e-commerce package simply because so many companies are automating this now. For small folks wanting to get into e-commerce, you're much better off going to a Wix page, a GoDaddy page, or a Shopify page, because this is all built in. The idea that you have a shopping cart, you have a way to do transactions, that you have a way of verifying that somebody is who they say they are by having logons, even maintaining marketing and email campaigns. And again, this is simply a way to be able to create e-commerce in a box, and a lot of this now is software as a service. And again, if we get to merchant server software packages, again, if you are wanting to build this at an enterprise level, you can do this as well. We're talking about things like IBM, WebSphere, and Oracle. Again, the concept is more important here because these packages are going to change. I think that if I had one thing to remind you of out of any of this, if you are growing a business, if you're starting small, you're probably going to be using software as a service anyway in 2023 and beyond. So what are the things you need to think about? Again, if you're thinking about creating your own website versus using Shopify or Wix or GoDaddy, these are things you want to think about. For example, number one, and above all this, what's your expertise level? Are you able to create pages yourself, or do you need a point-and-click system? Do you want to have to deal with credit card transactions yourself, or do you want to have somebody else do it and have them maintain the liability? How big do you want to get? Is a Wix page going to be enough for you, for example? What about mobile? One of the best things too, although there's something to be said for developing mobile apps, and we'll talk about that, at the very least, does your website scale well in the mobile environment? And you need to think about this stuff. Are you going to be doing business internationally? If so, are you going to have different language versions of your pages? And what about shipping? Do you want to deal with international shipping or not? Or are you dealing with drop shipping? All things you're going to have to think about. Again, this is stuff that's a little bit legacy, but I like to include it simply so you know where we've come from. When we start talking about hardware, it simply means how powerful is your system? How big are your hard drives? Where does the website actually live? And this affects how fast your speed is going to be. The biggest thing you need to think about, the biggest thing that brings sites crashing down, I'm thinking recently, for example, of the Taylor Swift ticket sales where Ticketmaster's system is crashing. If you have a lot of people trying to hit the site at the same time, regardless of how robust your system is, it may get overwhelmed. So what are things that factor in? Well, how many people are trying to hit at the same time? What about the content? If it's a static web page that just has a picture on it, you can deal pretty well with that with multiple people hitting it at the same time. If we're talking about dynamically generated pages, if I'm a company that makes a custom page for everybody based on their login, there's processing behind that. How big is your site? How big is your inventory? How much stuff is there to search? The bigger your catalog, the bigger your breadth of sales, the more information you're going to have to deal with. And we start talking about the speed of legacy applications. Companies that have existed for long periods of time may have databases that go back literally decades on old architectures and old hardware that can't keep up with the new front ends. And what that means is if your database is gasping for air and it's feeding your dynamically generated pages, those pages are not going to come up quickly. We start talking about scalability. I do want you to know what this means. You have two ways you can scale, vertically or horizontally. Vertically simply means you upgrade the computer. If you have a web server, you can give it more RAM. You can give it a faster internet connection, for example. That's vertical scaling. Horizontal means that you are splitting out functionality of a system over multiple servers so that not one component is getting overstressed. And again, a lot of people simply say, I don't want to deal with this. I'm going to outsource the whole thing. Why? Because there's a lot of competition in that sector between Amazon Web Services, GoDaddy, and the hosting service of your choice. So not a lot of people are choosing to upgrade their own hosting at this point in time. So these are some examples of vertical and horizontal scaling techniques. For example, again, it comes down to if you're improving the performance of an individual computer, you're making it taller, better, and stronger. That's vertical. If you're splitting the work, that's horizontal. Other things that you can also do is think about allowing caching, for example. And again, I know this isn't a computer science class, but if we have caching enabled, that means when somebody loads up their website, part of it will already be on their local computer. The bottom line is really you want to have a clean, efficient site with not a lot of junk code in there. Other things that you need to think about in terms of actual web commerce or e-commerce design. Think about yourself as an end user. Think about how difficult it is to use your site, for example. We start talking about things like meta tags. If you ever mouse over a graphic and a description comes up, that's useful at a couple levels. Number one, a person with a disability with a screen reader can still know what that image is. But number two, it might actually make it show up in a search engine. Anything you can do to make your company unique, whether it's unique names, unique verbiage, unique expressions, makes it more likely to show up in a Google or Bing search, for example. You can also offer expertise, and what I mean by that is if you're selling a new product or service, give away some information about it. You can also advertise your site. You can get it on search engine advertising. We'll talk more about that when we get into marketing. But local e-commerce is also one that you might want to be able to do. For example, why would you want somebody to register their email? Well, you might want them to register your email or download the mobile app so you know when they're close to one of your stores through things like geofencing to be able to target them with advertising. So we start talking about search engine optimization. Again, we'll be talking about this repeatedly. What that simply means is your business showing up in the top 10 hits or first two pages of Google when somebody searches for it? If not, you might be in trouble. What does that mean? You need to have ways for your search or for your company to show up in a Google search or a Bing search to be able to answer somebody's need. If I search for ride sharing, I'm going to get everything from taxi cabs to other ride sharing services like Lyft. If I enter in Uber, I'm going to get Uber right away. So brand names help you come up. Unique content helps you come up. Credibility helps you come up. So what annoys people, I could ask you guys this, but I think we all have very similar ideas. If we visit a website 3 times in the same week and there's no new content, we tend to get bored. If we don't have a search function, a way to easily get around a website, if we got dead links, it looks unprofessional. Other things too. Slow loading pages. I think misspellings also are showing poorly on websites because they don't look legitimate. Some of the other things that drive us crazy too, the idea that I don't have somebody who I can reach out to if I have a problem. There's no contact information. If we've got things that are unnecessary, graphics that take a long time to load, and if you hit the back button, if it gives you an error message, that really ticks people off. So what are the most important things when it comes to e-commerce page design, websites? Ultimately, people want to be able to buy stuff. They want to be able to quickly find information easily. If you look at Amazon.com, it's not an exciting looking web page, but it loads quickly and it's easy to find what you're looking for. It works on Chrome, it works on Microsoft Edge, works as a mobile app or on a mobile web browser, and the graphics are easy on any platform. So in terms of other types of interactivity and active content, again, this is not a programming class, this is not a computer science class. If you're getting into using these kinds of tools, it simply means you're coming up with ways to create dynamic content and, again, things like widgets and ASP. I think what it really comes down to at this point in time, we are into what we refer to as the relationship era of marketing. That means once we get a customer, we want to keep them. So there's a reason, for example, why, for example, Amazon want to know where I go on the internet. Why? Well, they want to know what other sites am I visiting? What am I interested in? How can they possibly gear content to be things I would want to buy based on my other behavior? And that is part of how we build relationships with customers, by giving them what they want and knowing them better. So in terms of privacy, we've got a balancing act. Because generally speaking, the more privacy, the more security you add onto a site, the less user-friendly it is, the slower it is. because these things simply take more time. When we get into our chapter on security, you'll see how encryption, although it's a good thing, also absorbs and takes bandwidth, for example. So privacy simply means we're telling our users how we're protecting your data. For example, are we using logons and usernames to protect your data? Are we, for example, giving you a way to recover your password? And are we also telling people how we're using their data? And accessibility simply means we need to make sure that our websites are available for use by persons with disabilities. This is really becoming a big issue in things like smartphones, for example, and screen readers. So here's my question. If we get into the touchscreen era, if we get into the idea of interactive or augmented reality, how do we make this inclusive? It's really a tough challenge. It's something that we're still figuring out. If you know somebody, for example, who has a visual disability, there are ways to use PCs and smartphones that require audio, for example, but that also means when you're creating websites, you need to make sure that you're using meta tags so screen readers can pick up on them. So these are things we will be talking about as well. So then we're getting into what is one of the most important parts of our discussion, and that is how we plan for mobile. No matter what company you're hosting with these days, if you are not hosting your own website or using a template, most of these companies have ways, for example, to automatically scale for mobile devices. So you can use, for example, a mobile version of Google Chrome or Safari, and we refer to that as responsive web design. That means, for example, a website will scale for a mobile platform. Then we've got several types of apps. We've got mobile web apps, which means you've got something that can run on any kind of mobile device. For example, if I download a version of Google Chrome that will run on an iPhone or run on a Google device, that's great. Native apps are ones that are only made for specific devices. For example, the email app on an iPhone, although it'll accommodate multiple types of email, is specific to the iPhone. And then we got what we refer to as a hybrid app, and that simply means there are apps that make use of existing components within a smartphone, but that are somewhat downloaded. So the parts of the content that you're downloading are new programs, but they're making use of existing programs. One of the best ones I can think of, I use Waze. And Waze, although it is an app, it's a hybrid app because it also makes use of Google Maps for its information. So when you start thinking about mobile presences, for example, which way are you going to go? We have a philosophy now called mobile first design. If you've got an inkling that most of your users are going to be using smartphones as their primary means of access, then why not design for the smartphone first? If you do a mobile website or a mobile web app, those are the least expensive. Particularly a mobile website, you're just making something that scales. Native apps are the ones that are the most expensive to create, take the most amount of time. But then again, if you're Amazon, for example, why wouldn't you have a native app for both iPhone and for Android? So things that you need to think about whenever you're designing for mobile. Again, physical screen size is smaller. The connections don't tend to be as fast. Cellular networks are not as fast. The processors are not as fast on smartphones. So you're going to have centralized processing that works on a small display and also works well with a touchscreen. Other things to think about in terms of the graphics and how big they are. They're going to fill the whole screen, or you're going to have text-only versions available. Again, why not have mobile first design, or you could have responsive or adaptive, and that simply means, for example, responsive web design, it's a dynamic page generation tool that creates a mobile version of the site. Adaptive simply adapts the existing website. All I care that you know from this is that you need to think about who your users are and if you should be designing for mobile first. That's really the thing to think about. There are a number of development tools. Again, these are for your information. Things to think about if you know that your users, if you know the people who are going to be buying from you are using mobile as their primary, well then design there first. Mobile websites are less expensive than doing mobile or web app design, and again, it comes down to expertise and availability. Thanks for your time and attention, folks. Hope you have a wonderful day.